Hey all, we will give it just a minute or so for folks to join. All right, it's 2 minutes past. Let's get this party rolling. I pasted the doc in the Zoom. I'm guessing you all already have it. This is the April 2nd, 2019 Working Group Long-Term Support Meeting. The meeting is being recorded. We will post it to YouTube just afterwards, so everybody please adhere to the Community Code of Conduct and be good people, because the world will see. So in the document, in the agenda doc, we've got a couple things there. If there's other things you want to talk about, feel free to throw them in there. I'm actually going to change the order slightly. I think one of these will be conversation and longer maybe than the others. So the first thing, just as a FYI, in the prior meeting, we'd been talking about trying to get on the KubeCon EU agenda, and I chatted with the program folks, and they added us for a deep dive, so we can have something along the lines of what we did at KubeCon North America in Seattle, and have a conversation about where we are. I think I'll do sort of the same thing where it's one slide and then conversation, hopefully. And we'll see how that goes. And the expectation is we'll have the survey results at that point, and have also done some discussion of a couple of specific proposals. And there's the variety of other things around discussion that are in flight. Dhaval, do you want to give us just a brief update on where things are with the survey at the moment? I see you unmuted, but I don't hear you. Okay, there you are.
Can you? Okay, seems to be some issues with network. I
We got
also
you now.
see your video pausing. So yeah, so last week we received the data from Stephen. He sent the data to the leads mailing list. Ehor responded saying we should probably avoid data sharing with everyone, especially when it contains IP address and email IDs. We should scrub that out and then share with everyone. I did not look at the complete survey yet. It's a multi-dimensional data, so to create, to use Excel tools, it's difficult. We don't have access to the admin account, so it's going to be it will take some time to pull out all the data and understand where it is. But from the perspective what we discussed in last meeting, we had about 490 tries against what we knew earlier, that we had 490 people completing the form. There were about 240 completions and about 50% completion rate or drop-off rate. It's the same. That was when I looked at the data, it seems like first or second or third question is where people stopped. The first question is, do you use Kubernetes, and say yes or no. The second question is the relevant question, which says, which persona you belong to. So if people did not answer second or third questions and they dropped out, it seems like a lot of those people just started the survey and did not finish it because they got busy with something else. So it looks like not a lot of drop-off rate versus what the 50% completion rate states in, if you look at the SurveyMonkey data. We don't have access to SurveyMonkey, so not much data got done, but I tried to see if we had genuine participants, and people who provide their emails are usually genuine participants. So about 80 plus participants had their email provided. and the crowd was pretty spread out. And I also looked at IP addresses to see if they were, coming from the same source, what was the variance, and I saw that there were very few duplicate IPs. And yeah, so as I get more data, I'll probably get more details on. I mean, yes, there was a good trend towards cluster people who call themselves cluster operators and cluster users who fill the data. I did feel that some people have repeated like what we have instructed in the survey itself. If you think you belong to multiple profiles, you should probably fill the survey again as a second profile. It was one of the instructions we had passed on. So it looks like people have repeated that. So yeah, so more accurate numbers. I've given very approximate numbers, rounded off them in different places. So more accurate numbers once we have better tooling. I'm writing a Python script to pull and do some analysis on the data, on the multidimensional data. And I think Tim has added some details on the distribution of different roles. So if you look at the count of all the data, of all the numbers that Tim has provided, I filtered out all the blank responses. So that kind of leads you to about 200 participants who were either cluster operators or cluster users, which is a good number. But I'll be more confident once I have my script in and all the data in. The survey ends on April 26th. Recommend everyone to pass the URLs to everyone you think should fill this survey. Advertise, advertise, advertise. Thanks, Tim. Back to you.
So Josh mentioned in the Zoom the completion rate of 50%, like having something for a raffle might have made that higher, but at the same time, 240 completions is actually pretty good. Looking at the numbers of distributors and hosting providers and vendors, we actually have a fair amount of them compared to like the list of certified distros, hosting providers, vendors, because that number seems to hover around 70 or 80. So I don't know. I think we definitely have a lot of responses.
So one more metric I got from Stephen was the average time that people took to finish the survey was about 5 minutes. So the Survey Monkey says it should take about 11-minute max for someone to fill a survey, and the average time we have people spend on the survey was 5 minutes and 41 seconds. Josh, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. So one question that I would have is, for this data gathering effort, do we want to do a second data collection specifically for the large distributors to give us aggregate information? That is, for Google and VMware and Red Hat and the other large vendors to give us aggregate information covering the same data, but in their case, it's not going to be which version are you on, it's going to be what's the approximate distribution of which version your customers are on. I think that would be a kind of a good way to complete this data set.
So we ensure that we're getting responses specifically from them.
Yeah, well, because the example is that, the existing survey that we have is a really good way to cover cluster operators, and vendors that have small numbers of customers. But the thing is, there's a lot more people on GKE who haven't, touched this survey. And we can get useful aggregate data from the large vendors as a complement to this individual survey response. And we could basically use the same questions, just replace the checkboxes with numbers.
I feel like when we talked about this before, there was a concern that the vendors wouldn't want to share this information.
Yeah, well, if they don't share the information, then we don't get it.
Yeah. But yeah, obviously you got to ask first, right? Yeah. So.
The I mean, I haven't cleared this at Red Hat, but I'm reasonably sure that we would be happy to share it as long as there wasn't anything, customer identifiable in it. And aggregates of like a graph, a line graph of which version are you on would not include identifiable information. So I mean, the main counter argument I can see to doing that is that because of the nature of who contributes to Kubernetes, we get plenty of feedback from the large vendors already, who's on this call, and we don't actually need to collect that data.
I was interested to see that we had 41 people who identified primarily as developer contributor on the project. It's going to be interesting to get the data sliced and diced and see what the responses look like for the different subsets of users.
Yeah.
Especially when you remove out all the blanks. Because I think the number of blanks will reduce the developers' distributors significantly.
And our very first question, are you or your customers currently using Kubernetes today? A bunch of the blank responses where like all of the subsequent answers are blank. Their first response there was no. So they went to the survey and are like, oh no, this doesn't apply to me. And then they stopped.
You mean the survey didn't automatically exit when they said no?
Well, I'm guessing they did, that it did, or they broke off at that point because they answered no on that first question, and then that was it. So they bailed from there, which would make sense. I mean, I guess that's a good sign, but it's slightly fascinating to me to see that based on the way I thought we described the survey, that people landed on it and then were like starting to fill it out, and then nope, never mind, this isn't me.
Well, I mean, it might have been an interest survey, right? In the future, how do you imagine yourself upgrading Kubernetes?
Yeah.
Which is not a survey I'd actually want to do, but they might have thought that's what it was.
Yeah, so we gotta do some looking, and it's good actually that we got this this first data dump, because it's like it's 500 rows I think and 140 columns or something. So there's just there's a few dimensions there. All right, well, I guess that's probably enough for the survey topic. But yeah, we should look and consider, and I think we'll want to look at the ones that are distributors, host, or vendor ones and see if they left an email address or whatever, and see if we can figure out, do we have the big vendors represented or not? And we can always try and pull some additional data. Oh, and just to be clear, since there was a question on the Zoom, we just got a snapshot of this basically privately. We're not sharing it yet because we want the survey to stay open and be not be influenced, and we haven't done the full anonymization of that data dump yet. But this is just sort of an FYI to us, so we could start seeing what the data is and thinking about how we would parse it and process it. So we've got a couple other things on the agenda that are more open-ended conversation. The first one I wanted to bring up is Jordan started a document, or I think it was Jordan. I know you shared the link to it, but there's a document that's linked there in the agenda called Kubernetes Supportability External Dependencies. This is a fascinating and problematic area. So and it's central to what we're talking about here. But Jordan, do you want to say anything about the document? I know a lot of the people on the call have started collaborating on it already.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. Yeah, so this is sort of step one, or a launching point for a lot of different efforts. We have a lot of a lot of things going on sort of at the same time, and we wanted to make sure that they were well informed and that we had eyes that kind of could see everything that was going on to make sure we were picking up any gaps. So if you jump into that document, there are, I think, 4 kind of main efforts related to getting a handle on our dependencies. The first is just to find out what the actual supportability of our dependencies are, things like Go and etcd and Docker and Containerd and Core DNS. Like actually understand how long are they supported, how are they supported, how do they publish bug fixes and security fixes and things like that, and are there gaps between what they support and what we say we're supporting. So that's pretty much an information gathering exercise. There are a few question marks still in there, and then if there are primary dependencies that aren't on that list at all, please add them, call them out. This isn't so much about like the add-ons and things like that. This is more like if you have a Kubernetes cluster, you are using one of these things, and a gap in supportability of one of these things would directly impact our ability to support Kubernetes releases as long as we want to. So that's getting filled out. That's helpful for identifying gaps, and then that gives us targets to say, all right, well, Golang has a 12-month support window. What does that mean for new releases that we put out? You know, do we need to be on the latest Golang in order to have a supported version of Go for the lifetime of Kubernetes? Or do we need to think about how we would switch and upgrade a release branch to a newer version of Go? Like, this gives us information that can feed into some of those discussions. The next item is probably the biggest gap and the most open-ended, and the one where we could use the most help, which is putting together processes to make sure that we test and ship things we support. So every release, we at the last minute update the release notes with, hey, here are the versions of external things. And it's kind of just looking at the list that we had the last release and searching in Git for things that touch those versions, and it's not a good process. And even that doesn't really make sure that we have test coverage of all of those things. And so
that's just reactive, right? That's
it's reactive.
What's some sense of what we did this last quarter?
It's less of a intentional, like, here are the versions we support and why, and here's where they're being tested, and more of a, well, I don't know, this is what the code says we're shipping, so I guess this is what we're shipping. Especially for the dependencies where we support multiple versions of things, I don't think we have test coverage of all of those versions. I think some of it is either manual or kind of, we test at the top and we test at the bottom and we just assume everything in between works. Anyway, this is, if I had to pick a section, this is probably the most understaffed and chronically problematic. The other things, we can get information and figure out ways to interlock with some of these dependencies on support windows and things like that. But this is all on us. This is just our release engineering test process. So if you're looking for a place to contribute, like I said, this is easily the most understaffed. The next section, so when I talked about this in SIG architecture, so the first 2 sections should make us feel bad and motivate us to just get rid of external dependencies wherever we can. So that's what the 3rd section is about. That's one way to clean up our test matrix, which is stop supporting so many external dependencies wherever possible. And so I gave some examples of efforts that are happening there. One, which is about to go in probably this week, is switching away from GoDeps to Go modules. So that's starting to using standard Go tooling and stop using a fork of an unmaintained tool. Other examples are collapsing onto the API-based interlocks with some of these components. So rather than taking a direct dependency on Docker via Docker shim, just use the container runtime interface. And then anything that implements that, including Docker via a container runtime implementation, we would support. So it gives us a single test target, and it gives vendors a single interlock target for their testing. So there are several of these: container runtime interface, container storage interface, container network interface. These are at varying levels of maturity. So container storage interface is actually the most mature. That's at 1.0 in the previous Kubernetes release, and is at 1.1 in 1.14, I think. So I think the effort here is to get these API interfaces stable, or if they already are stable in everything but name, like actually do the work to mark CRI as V1. If it hasn't changed in a year and a half and everybody's using it, we should probably call it stable. Yeah, so I linked to some of the things tracking those. Again, this list is likely incomplete. If you know of things that are going on to remove in-tree dependencies and move them out of tree, please add them and link them so we can have a better picture of what's going on. And then the final item in this doc is actual dependencies that we have that were either unmaintained or unmaintained is probably the biggest example. So there were a couple dependencies, log and the YAML library we were using that we forked and brought into the Kubernetes org because the original maintainers weren't updating them. So yeah, this is trying to serve as a gathering point so that we have visibility to everything that's going on. We're not duplicating effort. We can see gaps. And if people want to jump in to help, this can provide visibility to where help is needed. So.
Yes. Awesome, Jordan. I had a quick question about, do we have like a very high level barometer to tell us whether this problem is getting better or worse, or some gauge of how bad things are? And more interestingly, what the trend is, if it's getting worse or better.
I'm not sure how good of a signal it would be. We could look at vendor size, number of distinct dependencies. I haven't actually gone out and graphed that over time, but I don't imagine that would be difficult to do. The switch to Go modules is actually going to make it a lot easier to run reporting against that. Some of the existing tooling we had was pretty
okay. Because sometimes that's kind of an excellent first step, is just to figure out like, what is the angle of the trajectory of this thing? Is it like spiraling out of control, or as bad as it's ever been, or improving over time, or whatever?
Yeah, I know that we had a few pretty big dependencies drop in the last release. A few long deprecated things around our OpenAPI and REST handling stuff finally got removed, and that dropped a bunch. There are a couple cloud providers, I think 3 cloud providers that have been deprecated for a while. They're going to get dropped in 1.16, so that will drop a big chunk. Yeah,
I guess there's all the transitive dependencies there as well.
Yeah, so I mean, as those drop, their transitive dependencies drop as well. Sometimes, if we're still not using them. So there have definitely been more eyes on this area, and so things that bring in a lot of stuff to vendor are getting questioned now. So I don't think we are getting worse. I think there are a lot of things in flight that once they land will help a lot. And so it really is convincing people that these things are worth finishing, and we'll get a lot of benefit from it.
Awesome. One other slightly off the topic question, but this Go dep, is it these days? I forget which one it's. Go modules.
That's the original, the one and only.
Like about the 5th iteration of an attempt by Go to actually manage dependencies. Do we have any faith whatsoever? And I don't know anything about Go modules, but all the other ones were like replacements for the previous crap one, which then got deprecated. do we at some point just say, screw that, we're going to do our own thing because we've been through 5 of their failed attempts so far and we're not doing any more?
Yeah, so Go modules are the first one that is actually built into Go. So for better or worse, that is going to stick.
I understood that Go dep was as well. Not Go
No,
dep, not to be confused with Go deps, which was not.
Dep was, well, not to get too far into that. Dep was an official experiment, and it never graduated and actually got built into Go. So
Okay.
Go modules is in Go and will be enabled by default in Go 1.13.
Okay, that's hopefully a better signal than before. We had this glide thing as well, which I understood was the other, was it called glide? Something like that.
Yeah, there was glide, there was Go package, there was Go dep. All of those, Go dep was the most official of them all, but even that never made it all the way into Go.
So this is the actual one. So
Go modules is the actual one, for better or worse. Yes.
Can I suggest that we make a decree that if this actual one does not actually turn out to be the actual one, that we just not chase the next actual one, that we actually just solve the problem ourselves?
No, it's already shipped in Go, and the Go compatibility guarantees are significant. So I am confident that it will stick. It may evolve, but it will stick.
Okay.
And I think that the right people are working on the conversations there. So I just posted a link to Russ Cox's blog about dependency management, or one of his more recent ones just from like 2 months ago. And it's a solid read. This is a fairly fundamental problem in computer science around code reuse, and it's come to a head, but there's a lot of people in the Go community and the core who've been looking at this problem for like a decade plus, even outside of Go, and are, as much as it's painful to maybe feel like we're on a treadmill, like the state of the art is moving forward, and really smart people are pushing it forward in Go. So I think things are getting better here.
That's good to hear.
So I had a question with respect to rel-eng dependencies. I see a lot of, at least in product development, I see many times you don't consider the life cycle of rel-eng dependencies. For instance, Go has 12-month support cycle. There are lots of products out there that use older version of Go to build. If I look at Docker's support, it's about 7 to 12 months of security fixes. But since Go is only supported for 12 months, how does Docker, does it upgrade Go version after 12 months? How does it work? Is it necessary for us to look into such kind of toolchain dependencies if based on the pattern we see, say, Docker as a tool? As an example.
We definitely need to consider it if we want to support Kubernetes releases beyond 12 months. Then we would have to be prepared to switch Go versions if a security update came out, and to get that security update, we had to upgrade Go versions.
Not that I'm recommending this, but I'll point out that the other standard way for vendors to support an LTS is to actually push patches or carry patched versions of non-supported upstream releases.
Yeah, I'd be hesitant to have the Kubernetes project start maintaining a fork of Go. That doesn't seem great.
It's a toss-up of nasty alternatives, because I can tell you that if we produce an LTS on the basis that we are going to be upgrading to a supported version of Go, eventually we will run into a case where we can't without wholesale changes to the older release. Because if I've done both versions of LTS, the one where you push patches upstream, which is super painful and takes a lot of effort, and the one where you upgrade your dependencies. And the problem with the upgrading dependencies is sooner or later you run into a dependency that you can't upgrade and maintain backwards compatibility. And it'll happen, and we just, in our LTS policy or our practice, we need to come up with what do we do when that happens.
Yeah, I've had the same experience as you, for whatever it's worth, Josh. I've also done both, and they're both terrible, but the latter that you just mentioned is marginally less terrible in my experience.
I think it's a very important question, because say if Go is, someone else speaking? Okay. Yeah, so it's an important question because I think if Golang is supported only for 12 months support fixes, then that's where the slowest one decides your pace. So we should probably discuss what we should do in such cases when we see all those dependencies and which are beyond our influence area.
Yeah, and I think this feeds into our cost determination of what does it cost to support Kubernetes for X releases. Like right now we do 3. If extending that from 3 to 4, actually, we've got a couple stragglers here. Docker stands out as 7 months, but a couple stragglers. But if without a lot of grief, we could extend that to 4 releases and still fall within the support windows of our major dependencies, that could be reasonable. If extending that beyond 4 to 5 means, okay, well now we need to be willing to fork Go and carry backport security fixes. That's a significant step. I think this is input to those decisions and those conversations.
Yeah, I guess sometimes that boils down to the actual thing. So I mean, if Go doesn't have that many security releases in any given year, and backporting one patch is relatively straightforward, for example, then the cost is not that high. If Go releases dozens of security fixes every year, then that's a huge cost. And I don't know what those numbers.
I would actually disagree with that. I would say if that's going to be part of our process, then we need to maintain our own fork just all the time. What we don't want to do is try to define and set up this process of forking Go and backporting a thing in the heat of a security incident. So
no, don't. I totally agree. I wasn't actually arguing for anything other than that. I was suggesting that forking Go and doing very little with it other than forking it every however often, and backporting whatever security fixes they apply is not a huge cost if the number of security fixes is small.
Yeah, I think a project requiring a custom version of Go doesn't seem like a great direction to me. I would.
Philosophically, I agree. What I'm saying is practically the actual cost is a function of the number of backports you have to do. And if that number is very small, then philosophy aside, the actual practical cost is less than the practical cost of the alternative, which has all the other problems which Josh mentioned, which may be philosophically better, but practically much more costly. That was my only observation.
So that was all I had for this doc. There's lots of question marks and TBDs and places to jump in. So please don't just be a spectator.
Could you open up comment access, please?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Could you open up comment access to the doc or share it with the mailing list?
Everyone on all of the lists that I shared it with should have full edit access, actually.
Yeah, I have access.
If you're on Kubernetes architecture or LTS or testing or release, I think I shared it with a bunch of the groups. So join any of those lists and you should have access.
It's also shared with Kubernetes dev, so the whole community pretty much should have access to comment.
I commented. I think you probably logged in as somebody unusual if you don't.
Thank you. Yep. Human error as normal.
All right, back to you, Tim.
So, Davel, had you added the next one on the agenda, or was it Tim St. Clair?
I put that on there.
Okay.
I just saw Tim email it out and
Gotcha,
wanted
yeah.
to make sure people knew to go look at it again. I actually hadn't had a chance to read through the updates, so I don't know that other people did either, but wanted to poke people to read it.
So just to explicitly loop back, a number of meetings ago, Tim St. Clair had kind of talked about and drawn a picture, I think, just shared on the screen, talking about a model that they had used. I think this was in the University of Wisconsin's Condor project, if I recall correctly, but it was sort of a fork branch system of having a development stream and peeling off stable branches for support off of that. And he's started to flesh out the document describing how that goes operationally. And Jordan has linked the doc there in the agenda. So another one to read and think about and comment and ask questions. So the last thing on the agenda there, was this you, Nick, that added this one?
Yeah, it was. I just wanted to make it available to everyone. We were talking a couple of meetings ago about having people come and give experience reports, and I thought it'd be useful to just have a relatively standard set of questions that we could say, hey, you're going to give us experience report. Please make sure that you hit these things. That way we can make sure that everyone who is giving experience reports sort of we have like a common basis for comparison. I tried, it's pretty much based on the survey questions, on the assumption that, I mean, if people have filled out the survey, they can be like, oh, hey, I filled out the survey, all those questions are in my answer under this email, then that's also fine.
Yeah, I think I like the blueprint. Kind of gives us a good, guideline for someone who wants to share their experience but doesn't know which part of what they should share and what would make the best value. So this is a good guideline. Probably we should share it with anyone. I think last meeting we did discuss JP Morgan might want to talk about their Kubernetes experience. So maybe we can share a template like this saying, hey, we're looking questions. The group is interested in questions around this, apart from whatever else you want to talk about. There should be a guideline rather than a restrictive document, though.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to put in the document, hey, this is just an idea for the sort of things that we want to know, not an agenda or anything like that. I mean, I figured, I don't know about anyone else, but when I'm writing a talk or presentation or something, sometimes it's really nice to have, a set of questions that I need to answer to use as a basis for an agenda/story.
If anybody has comments or thoughts on that doc, throw them in there. It would be nice to have it kind of like agreed. And then I can take the AR to go ahead and start inviting people to the meeting and give them a specific slot on a specific day, time, agenda, and have them committed to showing up that day. So JP Morgan Chase, we'd had some discussions with them. Quentin had a contact there who he'd reached out to, and we chatted a bit. And at KubeCon, I talked to somebody from both Uber and Airbnb, and they were potentially willing to share some of their things. I think any of the companies that ends up on the keynote stage at KubeCon talking about how they're deploying Kubernetes is somebody who's going to have some interesting learnings and potentially has already demonstrated that they're willing to share them if they're up there on the keynote stage. So those are folks that we could reach out to, but I'll start pulling some of those people into the agenda. And Quentin's typing somebody else in there. So anybody else that anybody can think of for an entity, and then especially if you have a name there, that would help.
Yeah, Ticketmaster have always been a very kind of vocal proponent of Kubernetes, and they're always on stage. And I do know some of the people there. I'm sure I could reach out. I would imagine they would be more than happy to share.
Apart from that, we have another meeting that is the APAC region meeting. And if you have any partners who want to be part of that meeting, probably we should share with vendors who want to speak in that meeting too. If they're in a different region, maybe India, China, anywhere in Asia, Australia.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write the doc as well, is that way, if we do have people present to the non-US time zone meeting, then we can make sure that we don't miss out on any critical information. I guess I forgot to put it on there, but I don't think probably most people who are on the call right now mind too much, but I've been looking at we've got some requests to change the time a little bit later for the non-US time zone meeting so that people in India and EMEA can also join. Just been going through that process with the doodle letter post in the channel a few places. Put that link in.
Well, that puts us at the end of what's on the agenda. We do have a little bit of time yet if anybody has anything else that they wanted to bring up today.
Not for me.
Yeah. Are we planning on having any kind of an LTS meeting in Barcelona?
Yes, so we are on the schedule for a deep dive, and my intent is to do that basically the same as the BOF that we had at the Contributor Summit in Seattle. So one or so slides, just level set, and then conversation on where we are and what folks are thinking, and hopefully with a different audience there as well.
We would have someone speaking before. Okay. We would have Tim Sinclair's proposal because I do see some, I haven't gone through his proposal completely yet. So maybe we should also put this to test and get feedback from the community on what they think about this proposal.
The other thing I was going to mention was that if someone who is going to be there could please make sure to mention the non-US time zone call, since I will not be able to be there.
I am noting that down.
I don't know if the time will actually be convenient for Europe people, but
This one, depending on what part of Europe, isn't completely horrible, but it's definitely end of business day for most people.
yeah, as of next meeting, the meeting will have moved from 4 in the morning to 2 in the morning for me, thanks to daylight savings.
I think for one meeting it was a little better for Europe, and now it's back to what it had been. Time zones.
Maybe going away in Europe in 2 years.
We would rather have Earth be flat than a round, right?
It is flat, I thought.
I was just going to say, where do we get this round rubbish from?
It's not flat, because if it was, the cats would have knocked everything off of it by now.
I keep losing socks, so that's the only explanation. And on that note, maybe we should finish.
All right.
Agreed.
Thanks, everybody.
Everyone, have a great week.
Have a good day.
See you later.